All right. Well, we are in James chapter 3, and this is um, we're coming out of a chapter where we were largely discussing the idea of partiality and really um, the idea of partiality as it pertains to people, um, which is the easier element to understand. But there's also a partiality that we were dealing with that has to do with someone's sins. On one hand, it's easy to understand. Well, someone comes in to worship with us, and they're in these. And the example James uses is being in nice clothing with golden rings, and we give him a nice spot. And then the guy who comes in dirty clothing, we say, "Yo, you sit on the floor or stand over by the wall or something." And we do that because uh, the perception is the wealthy man has more to offer than the poor man. But that is being what James says, that's being a judge with an evil motive. Now, we can all kind of relate to that and see, okay, that makes sense that we need to love everyone equally. And in fact, this is a very impactful teaching because of its practical nature. What is it that should motivate us to treat people right? And really, it should be that they are people looking to know about God. We shouldn't, our motivation shouldn't be what do they have to offer us, but it should be that we value their commitment to God and their commitment to serving the Lord, and whether they're in dirty clothes or wealthy clothes really shouldn't make that much of a difference as pertaining to our perception of them and our desire to serve them. So that's great teaching, and I've seen this particular concept in teaching really has changed my approach towards people um, as, over the last several years. But then again, there's this other aspect brought up in this chapter, and that is, well, which sin do you prefer? And makes a similar case. Just as all people, we should not judge them based upon their appearance. We should judge them based upon their content, their desire to serve God, their faith, and if there's a rich person who is being ungodly, we need to correct them just the same as a poor person who's being ungodly. Those comparisons, um, it should be about the content of who they are, about what they're doing, not about what they look like. But sin is the same thing. What did God say about sin? That it's all wrong. And just because there's one that I find easier to justify than another does not mean that I get to ignore the one I find easier to justify and then and then get onto you about the thing I find less tasteful. And so James makes the same point. Like, look, don't sin. There's no preference in sin. There's no better sin. There's no more acceptable sin. Sin is sin. And if God expects you to love your neighbor as yourself, He also expects you to condemn all sin. And so there's these two ideas that He holds up. One is partiality when it deals with people, and another one is partiality when it comes to sin. And that's also another trouble that we tend to have, is where, see, I don't see this as being as bad. This is more acceptable, but that thing over there, man, that's terrible. James says, yeah, so you don't murder, but you commit adultery. You're still guilty. And that's really the point here is don't say, well, at least I don't murder when you're out there doing other harmful things. It all impacts your relationship with God. And we need to be fair, as Jesus would say, or Jesus said in, I think, John 6, judge righteous judgment. Judge things according to the scripture and just hold God's standard as the standard we live up to. So this concept transitions a little because now we're talking about another application of some maybe partial sins that we might be more willing to accept because they're internal. He's going to be talking largely about jealousy and selfish ambition and kind of some internal motivations. That's what at least an aspect of what James chapter 3 is talking about, is what are these internal motivations? And he throws it out there as to become a teacher, but really, he starts saying, test your tongue, learn to control your tongue, and you don't do that by always saying the right thing. So he starts kind of transitioning over into this idea. So that is our review for last week, and now going to go ahead and take a look at our new material starting here in James chapter 3. Let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, knowing that as such we will incur stricter judgment. So here's where he starts. Let not many of you become teachers. So why would this be an issue? Why would there be many people who want to be a teacher, and what can motivate people to become a teacher? It's one thing if you have a mastery of something and then you teach it. That would be the, or at least you have a knowledge you've developed, you've put in the effort to learn something that you would like to share. That's what it means to be a teacher, right? To have information that you're passing on to somebody else. But a lot of times there's more to being a teacher than just passing on information. There is a perception of prestige. And really, I think that is one of the aspects of being a teacher that James is addressing. He's like, that perception of prestige can be deceiving. So don't try and become a teacher for that purpose. And he brings out knowing that we will incur stricter judgment. Look, there might be a perception of prestige, but there's also you're being held to a higher standard. I was reading this morning, there was a comment that someone made talking about just a practical application of this. But look at these two verses, and this is Jesus. Here is John, not Jonah. 1 minute. John 3, verse 10. This is Jesus speaking to Nicodemus. Jesus answered and said to him, "Are you the teacher of Israel and you don't understand these things?" What did Jesus expect? He's saying, look, you can't be born again, or you can't be in the kingdom of God unless you're born again. And Nicodemus says, well, how can a man be born again? He can't enter into his mother's womb a second time. And Jesus is like, are you a teacher of Israel and you don't understand these things? This is not that difficult. And the idea, though, is if you're claiming to be a teacher, why don't you understand simple things? That's really the idea, is teachers should understand. Sorry about not noticing you there, Dan. Good to have you join us. Sorry, I have to admit people into the meeting now, but if I get to chat now, I don't notice when they jump on as readily. So Jesus was questioning Nicodemus, but his expectation was a teacher should know these things. Look again here in John chapter 9 and verse 40. This is after Jesus heals the blind man, and they were saying they overheard Jesus's teaching, and those of the Pharisees were with him and heard those things, saying to him, "We're not blind too, are we?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no sin. But since you say we see, your sin remains." See, that's another aspect of being a teacher, is you're saying, here, I can tell you what the Bible says. I can show you about it. I can instruct you in it. Well, if you can do all those things, then you should live up to that standard. But that's what James is addressing, is people who are looking to have the prestige. Sorry, I was switching to verses and I didn't even have the verses up on the screen. Apologize for that. So, but there are people looking to have prestige with the prestige of a teacher, and yet not the character that should go along with being a teacher. And someone like that, someone who has that desire, really what they want, what they are doing is they're jealous of the attention that, and ultimately jealous of the attention of the congregation. And one of the challenges with that is they're wanting what belongs to God. James will talk about that, but when you jealously desire the honor and attention of the congregation, and that's your motivation for taking a position, you really are trying to take what belongs to God and keep it for yourself. And that's really a bad motivation to become a teacher, and that's what James is addressing. But in addition to that, there's a standard that we can hold up, and this is what James is saying is the standard, the bare minimum standard to becoming a teacher begins with the heart. But he talks about it in a very practical way, because when you say the heart, you might say, okay, well, I think my heart is ready. So here's James' test. Is your heart ready? Have you developed the character and the quality you need to take the position of a teacher? And that's really what we're going to be talking about in here. Any thoughts or questions in this before we move forward? If not, then let's go ahead and take a look here at James chapter 3 and verse 2.
Well, I guess I have one thing, using that definition or the concepts that you've talked about of idolatry again, by putting things in the place of God is idolatry. So then if you're doing that, then you're putting yourself up as an idol, which just sounds a lot worse than just saying, you want the attention of the congregation. It really identifies what that really means and the motives behind it.
Yeah, but and the reality is, and this is one of the things that that is a challenge for our generation, if you will. A lot of churches, they like to call their preacher the pastor, and the pastors like to be called pastor. And the part of the reason for that is because it's a title, it's a prestige. It almost sets you apart from everybody else, and it's an honoring thing. And I've noticed, like, even for me, I would like, I don't have, like, if someone calls me Pastor Steve, I just say, just call me Steve. I don't need, I just do my part, my work in the body, and everybody else does their work. No one needs a title for it. It's what the Lord has allowed us to do. And that's really the reality of the situation. But, I worked with a guy, and he was, he made sure, he always corrected me because I called him Dan. He said, no, I'm Pastor Dan. He was the pastor of building maintenance. He didn't teach at all. He just painted the building, and I was doing a project for the kids' school, which was a Christian school, so it was connected to a community church or something. And the guy that was kind of giving me the lay of the land, he insisted on being called Pastor Dan. And I thought about that, like, why would he want to be called Pastor Dan? Why that? There's a prestige thing there. And I don't particularly like it. The only time I will introduce myself as a pastor is just because people, when I say preacher, not everyone gets what I'm talking about. But I never take that title because I think it is it leads to this sort of a temptation. So it's just one of those things where being a teacher is not about prestige. It's about sharing what you know about God. And there is it is not about taking admiration from the people. And it's right for, if someone wants to put themselves in that position, for them to hold him to a stricter standard. And that's what James 1 says, is that there is a standard for teachers, and you need to be able to live up to that, which is a good thing. It's good for people to live up to the standard. But the standard is not, and this is what we're going to get into, the standard is not be able to control what you say and how you present yourself at all times. That's not the standard. And that's what James is going to get into. The standard emanates from a different place. It doesn't start with your mouth. It starts somewhere else. So James is going to start talking about the challenge with stumbling and how we can overcome those things. And so he uses several illustrations here. So let's go ahead and take a look at these illustrations. James chapter 3, verse 2. For we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. Now, if we put bits into the horse's mouth so that they will obey us, we direct the entire body as well. Look at ships. Although they are so great and driven by strong winds, they are directed by a very small rudder wherever the inclination of the pilot desires. So also the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of great things. See how great a forest fire, or see how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire? And the tongue is a fire, the very world of iniquity. The tongue is set among the members that among our members as that which defiles the entire body and sets on fire the course of our life, and is set on fire by hell. For every species of beasts and birds, of reptiles and creatures of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by the human race, but no one can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. With it we curse men who have been made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come both blessings and cursings. From the same mouth come both blessings and cursings. My brethren, these things ought not be this way. Does a fountain send out from the same opening both fresh and bitter water? Can a fig tree, my brethren, produce olives, or a vine produce figs? Nor can salt water produce fresh. So here is, I love James because he talks in, it's like he's given a sermon, like he wrote down a sermon or gave us a manuscript. And he uses all these illustrations to make the point. And his first thing is we all stumble in many ways. And I want to just pay note, the transition that takes place here. James is a teacher, and he's saying, don't many of you become teachers. Notice how there's a you in that. I am a teacher. Don't many of you try to become teachers. But then verse 2, he doesn't exclude himself from the rest of this conversation. He says, for we all stumble in many ways. Notice what James does there. He transitions. He's like, look, we all have a similar problem, and we need to work on that problem. But how do we do it? If a man does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. This is the key to understanding the rest of what's going on, is this particular statement here. If a man does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. Why is that? Is the question. And he's going to give some illustrations, but there's a simple reason for it. Because and Jesus actually addresses this in a lot of his teaching as well, is that because the tongue, the source of what happens with the tongue comes from the heart. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 33, sorry, I'm looking. It says either make the tree good. I'm feeling like I'm not looking at what I wanted to look at. Give me just 1 minute to. Oh yeah, I'm jumping in the middle. I was mixing up two Matthew references I was going to look at. So Matthew 12:33. Here's the first one. I think this is the more effective one, but notice what Jesus is teaching here. Either make the tree good and its fruit good, or make the tree bad and its fruit bad. For the tree is known by its fruit. Here's the first thing. You know what is going on the inside of the tree. You know what's going on with the root system of the tree because of the fruit it produces. A sick tree is not going to produce vibrant fruit. A sick tree is going to produce sick fruit. And what you see hanging on the outside of the tree is an indication of what's going on. So if you were a orchard guy, you would live by this law. You would say, how do I know my trees are good and I don't have I'm not missing something that they need? Well, what kind of fruit are they producing? And Jesus is saying the same thing about us, is if the internal parts are working right, you'll see it in the external. 34, you brood of vipers, how can you being evil speak what is good? Very similar to what James is talking about. What part of the body is evil? That's the internal part, the hearts. And that's what Jesus says, for the mouth speaks out of that which fills the heart. There's a very simple statement, but this is what James is really getting at. The mouth speaks out of that which fills the heart. The good man brings out of his good treasure what is good, and the evil man out of his evil treasure what is evil. But I tell you that every careless word that people speak, they shall give an accounting of it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. So here you really just see this concept is it's not it's not just the outside that makes the difference. Now, maybe a bad tree might produce a piece of good fruit, but there's also going to be a piece of bad fruit, and that's really the idea Jesus is getting at is the tongue will pour forth from what fills the heart. And what James is saying here in James chapter 3 verse 2 is really a similar concept, is that if anyone doesn't stumble in what he says, if all his fruit is really, really good, then that's because his heart is really, really good. And so you need to say, if your motivation to teach is because you seek to help people learn something more about God, and you have that desire, you know something, or more likely you put in an effort to understand something about God, and you want to share that with others, or you like doing that process of putting in the effort, learning from it yourself and sharing with others, that's why that's the motivation to become a teacher. Or maybe you have lived a righteous life, like elders in the church. They are tested to find out, have they lived a righteous life? But if they have a lot of experience, and that experience is such a invaluable thing, where it's one thing, here's the theory. It's another thing, here's what it looks like. One thing I like when I was doing trade work, I always liked talking to the old timers, because they could tell you all these stories of things that went wrong and how to fix them. And they would give you just practical, useful information. One time I was working with this plumber. I used to put the pipe in the ground and the plumbers would connect them. I'd work for plumbing companies doing that. So we're replacing a water line. My company would put the line in the ground, and then the plumbers would connect the two ends of the water line to the house and to the water meter. But I was working with this old plumber, and he had been a plumber for like 50 years, and master plumber, all those things. And I was watching him cut soft copper pipe, which I've worked with for a long time. And he was saying something about, oh, if you want to cut it and have it perfectly round, all you have to do is this. He's like, everybody knows that, but I didn't know that. And I just kept my mouth shut and let him talk about how if you had a brain in your head, you would know this. And I just kept my mouth shut. But after that, because I worked with a lot of plumbers who did it a different way, and it was not nearly as easy. So when I learned that trick, it was just, I could do it all the time, and it worked out beautifully for me. But that's the thing. When someone has experience and they can give you those little tricks that make all the difference, that make it super easy to do, that's like valuable. That's a reason to become a teacher, because you have experienced things and you're able to negotiate the problems with success, because you've worked to know the information and you're able to share it with people in a clear way. Maybe you have personal abilities that lead to that. All those are good reasons to become teachers. In order to gain the high opinion of the church, in order to gain honor or praise or all those things, those are bad reasons to become teachers. And what James is saying here is, if your motivation is the right motivation, then it doesn't mean you're not going to stumble, but you're going to be a good teacher. But if your motivation is, I want people to like me, and that's just we would never say it that way if that was your motivation. You always have different things, but if really that is your motivation, because I want to be admired, I want to be liked, I want to be honored, I want to be looked up for, I want to be invited to dinners and people to do what I say, all those kind of motivations, James says you will never be able to control that. That's going to come out in what you say. You're going to teach a sermon that is not designed to teach God's word. At some point, maybe not all the time, but at some point, you're going to say things in your sermons that is going to steer people to admire you, You can't control it because that is what's filling your heart. And that's what all these examples are talking about, is just this idea of the motivation behind what you're doing is going to pour out in what you're doing. Verse 3, now if we put bits into the horse's mouth so that they will obey us, we direct their entire body as well. How do we do that? Well, the tongue is a source of it. It tells you what the motivation is. Look at ships also. They are so great and are driven by such strong winds and are directed by a very small rudder wherever the inclination of the pilot desires. So also the tongue is a small part of the body, but it boasts of great things. What is the, in this example, he's like, there's a great ship and it can handle, it can harness the power of the wind, right? So you have this great unstoppable force, the wind, and I can use that to my benefit. I can bend it to my will. And the rudder's like, and I'm in control of all of that. That's the idea there. It's just saying I'm taking credit for so much more than I really do. And you start seeing that motivation. So also the tongue is a small part of the body, yet it boasts of great things. See how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. Now here's the opposite example, right? Well, on one hand, the tongue, or that is saying, look at that powerful ship that I control. And James is saying, but also that beautiful huge forest is going to burn down because of a match. And as we look at California right now, the whole thing is on fire. We saw fires in Oregon and Washington. All those fires, the conditions were right, and it was just a small spark and flame. One person, and you hear the fire was lit by a family trying to do some gender reveal on their baby. That went wrong, and it started a big giant forest fire. Total accident. Did not intend for that to happen. But when you're up there trying to be a teacher for the wrong motivation, what do you think is going to happen? Same sort of thing. I did not intend for that to happen. Yeah, but you weren't doing what you needed to be doing. Your motivation was wrong. Verse 6 here, and the tongue is a fire, the very world of iniquity. The tongue is set among our members as that which defiles our entire body and sets on fire the course of our life and is set on fire by hell. Here you see, what is the destructive power of the tongue? I don't know if this is a proverb or if it's just a saying I've heard, but there's a saying that talks about how you can destroy in a moment with your tongue what has taken a lifetime to build. And ultimately, that's when your heart is inconsistent with with what you're saying, that's what's going to happen. So here's I want to go through all of these illustrations, and then we'll kind of talk about the big picture. So I'm not just racing through this trying to get it done. What I want to do is kind of just see the illustrations he's bringing up, and then what we'll do is we'll go through and talk about and talk about the bigger picture of what's going on. What's it mean for me in this? So yeah, it says that you can destroy in a moment what it took a lifetime to build with what you say. You might have a reputation for being honest, but one lie can destroy that. You might have a reputation for being honorable, but one outburst of anger in a public setting can destroy all of that. Why does that happen? Because you can't control the tongue. It causes a lot of problems, and taking honor positions with the wrong motivation is going to have that effect. Verse 7, for every species of beasts and birds, reptiles and creatures of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by the human race, but no one can tame the tongue. It is restless, evil, full of deadly poison. Here again, notice what he's saying is you can't tame the tongue. The tongue will speak out of its source. That's the idea. You can't control it perfectly. If the source is corrupt, then the corruption will get through, because the tongue is connected to the heart. It's not trainable. How do you fix the problem then? That's really the question. Boy, this sounds really bad. How do we fix the problem? Well, change the contents of your heart. Ultimately, that is the source. If you change that, the tongue is going to speak out of the good, and you'll never mistakenly speak evil. If your heart is 100% pure and your motivations are pure and good, and you are truly, completely dedicated to serving God, you're never going to accidentally speak evil things, because that's not the motivation of what you're saying. If you have pure motivation and your heart is truly good, you're never going to accidentally speak evil things. That's what Jesus said. And think about Jesus. Why is it that everything he said came from the Father? What does that tell you about his heart? It indicates that his heart was completely loyal and dedicated and totally on board with God. So his words were always God's words, and he was completely surrendered to the Lord, and that shows in what he's saying. And really, that's the same thing for us. If you change the internal motivation, if you adjust that part of your life, then the things that come out the things that are expressed in your life, not just through your tongue either, through your actions and other things as well, will be good. And you don't have to get control and be alert to what you're going to say, because you'll have control over those things. With it, we bless our Lord and Father, and with it, we curse men who have been made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come both blessings and cursings. My brethren, these things ought not be that way. Does the fountain send out from the same opening both fresh and bitter water? I want to stop right here. This is for me one of those areas where it's just a great illustration. Some of you, I know many of you have probably heard this before, but it's one of my favorite illustrations to use because it's so effective. Let's just say in fact, when I was a kid, there was in the Green River Gorge, which was out kind of in between Enumclaw and Black Diamond. So maybe none of you know where that is, but this is an actual place. There was a hose, kind of like a piece of poly water pipe sticking out of the hillside, and it had a trickle of water coming out. Supposedly, that water was like pristine, pure spring water, the best you could get. And so people would always be on the side of the road filling up these gallons and gallons of this water, because it was like pristine, pure spring water. So now let's just say that pipe is, you have that fountain, coming out. There's this pure spring water you can go and buy. But once a week, a little shot of sewage got shot out of that pipe. And then this clear spring water coming out again, maybe once a day, just like for like 3 seconds, out some sewage, and then you get back onto the pure water for the rest of the day. How many of you would fill your water jugs up with that pipe? None of us would, because that is not right. There's a lot of contamination that goes on, even though it is, mostly pure. That contamination represents something, a major problem with that plumbing on that pipe, right? It's connected to more than just pure spring water if that's coming out too. And that's what James is saying is, look, a fountain, a good fountain, the purest water you can get is not plumbed into a sewer system too. It's pure because its source is pure. And it's the same thing with us, is if it's going to be the purest fountain you can get, it's because the source is pure. If it's got bitter coming out too, it means its source is corrupted in some way. And that needs to be corrected before you start calling that pure water, because it really isn't. And so that's really, you kind of get down to what is the source? What is it coming from? Why is it doing that? Can a fig tree, my brethren, produce olives, or a vine produce figs? Nor can salt water produce fresh. So he's just saying, look, things, the source is where they get their produce from. So as we're talking about, as we talk about teachers, one of the important elements of being a teacher is to make your motivation right. Your motivation to be a teacher should not come from a desire to take recognition that belongs to God. It should come from a desire to share what you know about God, to help others, uh, walk right before God, to instruct others in God's word, to bring glory to God in what you do. That's the proper motivation for a teacher. But not everybody wants to be a teacher. But this lesson doesn't just say, okay, well, if you don't want to be a teacher, then you can go to sleep for 10 minutes while I talk about this, or in my case, maybe 30 minutes. But the motivation, because this is actually true for everyone. If you want to call yourself a Christian, then the motivation isn't so people think more highly of me. The motivation to be a Christian is to honor God, and that's really, you start going through this, is we need to change the heart. And this also is a problem-solving tool, because maybe we have struggles in this, and what James says, we all stumble in many ways, and this is a good tool. What is it when I struggle, when I stumble in these things? What is the problem in my heart? What is it that I desire that I shouldn't? What is what motivates me to desire that? And that's the source. That's the thing we're working on. So there's a lot of times where you can look at those things and say, okay, why is that happening? We can use, he's talking about the tongue. One of the more obvious things, you might see is if someone is using bad language in their life, or that sort of a thing. Why do people accidentally use bad language? And a lot of times it's not, I don't just on its surface assign a dark, bad heart. It could be just bad habits in your heart, bad thinking habits, right? When someone has, let's say, a new Christian, they're going to make a change in their life. They're in the habit of using bad language, but the thoughts they use, the way they process words in their mind, is going to include that sort of thing as well. And when that's in there, it comes out. When I was a young man, I was kind of still going to church, but not really living right. And so I was kind of having that dual life. But I remember this was before Mel and I ever dated, but I was driving my truck with my little sister and Mel in my truck, and something happened, and I let a bad word slip out. And I was really embarrassed about that, because I would never talk that way in front of them, but I did talk that way at work. But that slipped out because what was in my heart? What was the words going through my mind? So if you want to stop that, then you need to stop using those words in your mind. If that's a challenge you have, or someone has, one thing you can do is stop using that language when you think. And if you remove it from the words in your mind, it's not going to come out the words of your mouth. That's one of the ways you do that, and you do that because it's impure and not right. And we'll look at some verses about that, but that's kind of an example. If you want to, if you don't want to say negative things about people through your mouth, maybe don't think negative things about people in your mind. Don't carry those kind of thoughts around. Don't hold resentments, and maybe think about people in a different way. So as we start talking about, well, how do I have there's a scripture, and it says, let your words always be with grace, seasoned as it were with salt, so that you may know how to respond to each person. So how do grace is really, you just take that concept. Words that are graceful are words that give a gift that isn't deserved. Sharing God's word, or even just kindness, compliments, praise and that sort of thing, you can really build people up in that. But if you want to be that kind of person, it begins with speaking words that are kind and thinking highly of people and looking for the good in them and that sort of a thing. And so really all of this, it has a very practical element where we see that if we can modify what's going on in our heart, then we can modify what's coming out of our mouth. And there are times when there are some jealousy things going on in your heart, and that might lead to all sorts of challenges. So this is it, so as you think about that, I don't want, and the mouth is the most it's elevated in this conversation, but it also can play out in any sinful thing. All sin is sourced from the heart, and James actually talks about this in chapter 1. He's like, you don't sin because God made you sin. You sin because you have a lust that you have made a plan to act on, or you have chosen to act on. If you resist it, it will go away. But if you don't resist it, then it's going to stay with you. And so this is a focus on one area, but really it carries a lot of diversity as far as the way it can apply to your life and the usefulness of it. Any thoughts or comments on this so far before we move forward?
How far are we moving forward?
I want to get to the end of chapter 3.
So I just wanted to give an idea on verse 8. It says, but no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil. Well, actually, I guess 7 and 8. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no one can tame the tongue. That reminds me of, in the insurance business, there's this type of liability for things that are inherently dangerous. And one of those examples is if you have a pet tiger. Have what's called strict liability. It means even if you had a secured fence and something happened, a tree fell down, nothing you could control, and it broke the fence, your tiger escaped and killed people, you're still responsible. Even if somebody breaks in and gets into the cage and it kills them, you're still responsible because it's a tiger. And so it's one of those things where the tiger is going to do what tigers do, no matter how much you train it, it's still in its heart is a tiger. And so the tongue can be tamed and trained, but it's still going to do what it is in its heart. So it's not a matter of just training and taming the tongue. It has to be done at the heart level, and then the tongue will show what's been done in the heart. So it's very similar to what we've said so far, but it's just an example that I was familiar with personally, and so.
Yeah, no, that's a great way of saying that. Appreciate that. It's kind of going down the road James went down, like a great illustration to help us understand how these things work. So I want to look at a couple of verses here in Ephesians is a good place to start because he deals with this concept pretty well. Look at here in Ephesians chapter 15. It says, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow in all aspects to him. So one of the things that we are taught to do by Paul is, okay, speak the truth in love. I just appreciate that because it shows what's the motivation behind it. When is that going to become the product of your life? When is speaking truth going to be what you do? It's sourced from love. And so you see that idea, and he goes on even more in this chapter, but number one is speaking the truth in love. Ephesians 4 verse 29, it says, let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification according to the need of the moment, so that you will give grace to those who hear. Here again, you just see that idea. Don't let unwholesome words proceed from your mouth. Where does that start? Where does that process begin? Don't let unwholesome words rattle around in your heart, in your mind, in your thinking. Don't think unwholesome things, and then those words will come out. But also there's an instruction here as Christians, we're not to let unwholesome words proceed from our mouth. This, let me real quick, this word unwholesome. Give me one moment. I need to look away from the camera for a moment. The word is if you look on the, if you can see on the left side of the screen, there it kind of gives the Greek definition, but it means rotten, worthless, or bad. Let no rotten, worthless, or bad word proceed from your mouth. And that's just a genre of speaking. It says, don't do that. Well, how do you prevent that from happening? Well, don't let any rotten, worthless, or bad word being in your thoughts. Don't let that exist in your thoughts. Let's look forward again. Ephesians chapter 5, starting in verse 4. There must be no filthiness, silly talk, coarse jesting, which are not fitting, rather giving of thanks. So here again, let's go ahead and take a look at these words. Filthiness is obscenity. That's kind of the idea, or shameful or dishonest, but just kind of no filthy word, obscene word. What you might say is vulgar, no vulgar type of language. Beth, you had a thought?
I do. I was just going to also say, not just the actual words that we speak, but the tone that we use when we speak them. Like, it also tells you kind of where your heart is too, because like you may be saying something nice, like the words are fine, but your tone says otherwise. Like you're actually upset, or like that is something that is easily slipped by. But like if you think about the way you speak, not just the words, but how your tone is when you use your words, it helps you identify if there's an underlying seed of sin there, because you may be like, well, I said the right thing, but then if you think about how you said it, then you're like, oh wait, I kind of sounded condescending. So what's going on there? And that's kind of also something to think about.
Yeah, no, that is a great point, Beth, that you're bringing up. You think of the tongue as how you communicate, but that's a small part of how you communicate. There are other factors, and a lot of times those are the things that will betray your true intention. So the sarcasm, what you're saying, or even your body language of what you're saying, a lot of those things they just communicate. Contempt is communicated through body language as much as it is through words you speak. And that's why we might say, well, you said I'm sorry, but you didn't mean it. So that's a really good point. And I appreciate, bringing up the broad spectrum of communicating is all of that. If it's consistent in your heart, then all that stuff will just line up. Being sincere is really, if what you're saying is sincere, then your heart agrees with your words, and the whole aspect of your expression will be consistent. But if your heart doesn't agree with your words, then your expression will be inconsistent. Whether the words are right, still the other elements of expressing those words will be inconsistent. What a great point, Beth. I appreciate you bringing that up. So here in Ephesians chapter 4, or chapter 5, verse 4, it says no filthiness, which is obscenity, silly talk, which is, if you look at the Greek meaning for that, it means stupid talk, like, nonsense kind of things, and coarse jesting, which also carries this idea of um, of being impure, vulgar, and generally, kind of vulgar of a sexual nature, that sort of thing. So Paul says, let there be no filthiness, silly talk, or coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving thanks. Notice how it's interesting to me how giving thanks stands in there. When you're being obscene or ridiculous and vulgar, those stand in the way of honoring God. They prevent you from honoring God. And Paul says, make that change. He's like, don't allow this to prevent you from honoring God. And when you have this, you can't honor God. And James says, from the same fountain come forth both pure and salty water. And that's the same idea here, is it can't be both. So switch your mind, let your heart give honor to God in everything you're doing. And this is clear. And the reason I bring this up, this is clear instruction for the Christian. There's not a lot of latitude in what is being taught here. The Bible is very clear what a Christian's position on the content of what they say. It is required for a Christian to have content that honors God, and the way you're going to do that is by altering the condition of your heart. And really, that's the point. That's throughout all this, it's fairly a consistent message here. And you might say, well, how do I change what my mouth says? Well, it starts with changing what's in your heart. You can't just change what your mouth says. You change your heart. Dan, you had a thought?
Well, a question.
Yeah.
First off, my internet is being worked on right now, so if I cut out, I might just have to go away. But the silly talk that we looked at back in Ephesians, it's pretty common for us at the church building. Guys, I mean, women are too sweet to do this, but guys are known for kind of teasing one another or jesting with one another, or put downs, or it's done out of fun. But some people could consider that silly talk. I'm just curious what your thoughts are, what your take is on, just our normal behavior. We'll do it at social gatherings with each other, and mostly we do it just with friends. But what's your take on that, as far as, does that fit into silly talk?
Yeah, that was a big question I had concern about you as well. So.
Well, I was asking for you, Jim. So
I figured.
Not really.
It's one of those things that's a little bit more challenging, but if not to knock on teenage boys, but I would that's what comes to my mind. How do teenage boys talk about things? Like some of the ideas that they'll run with, and they're just kind of dumb. I think that's, maybe that would be, and sometimes it's innocent, sometimes it's not. But, just kind of things that are just kind of dumb. Makes people think I had a better answer for this. I had taught on this a few weeks ago, and I can't recall specifically. Give me 1 minute.
While you're looking at that,
thanks for asking that hard question, Dan.
Yeah.
Or Jim.
Is it also like when talking about the elders, how they act in a way that's appropriate for the time? So if we're in a silly situation, then perhaps, that kind of talk is okay. But if we're needing to be serious and sober-minded, those kind of things that they list out, is that perhaps the situation, or is that a stretch?
I think sober-mindedness, not being sober-minded would be one of those things. Here is what, so the Greek definition, I think this is helpful. So the Greek word is morologia, So the first, it's a combination of two words. First is moros, which is where we get the word moron. And logia is, we've been talking about that in the John class. Logos, it's not just your words, but it's kind of your thoughts and expressed in words. And this is the way Louw-Nida, a very serious lexicon, defines it. It says talk which is both foolish and stupid. Foolish talk or stupid talk would be another translation. And so it says, nor is it fitting for you to use indecent, foolish, or dirty words. That's Ephesians 5:4. But just that, I think just when you start getting definitions like that, foolish and stupid, you start saying, let's have a serious conversation about, something that is just blatantly wrong, something that is blatantly harmful or goes against God, something that, like, let's make a plan on if we were going to rob a bank, how we would do it. That might be that kind of thing where it's just foolish and dumb. It can, or let's make a plan on assassinating the president. Like, why would you have that conversation? Even if it could be, so I think it's just things that really, like what I think Jim said is probably right, shows a lack of judgment, expresses a lack of judgment. And when you're talking, or could be taken in a way that it's not intended because of the content of it. And, that sort of a thing. It's just, someone's going to misunderstand it easily and be harmed by that. Those sorts of things, I think, is really what that's dealing with. Sandy, you had a thought?
Well, it comes to mind of being in a work situation too, where you're, somebody's telling a joke, or somebody's got a group and they're all agreeing on something that's inappropriate too. A lot of people want to be included and want to, be recognized as being part of the group, but then something comes up like a dirty joke or something, and you're given the opportunity. Do you stay and listen, or do you walk away? It's just a thought.
Yeah, and I think that where you start talking about coarse jesting and that sort of a thing, that is exactly the right thing, is dismissing yourself from that stuff. And I think a lot of this, really, this is genres of speaking. So it would cover a broad spectrum, but the idea here, or all of these things, detract from our giving thanks to God. And so there are all sorts of conversations we can have that are foolish to do, not sober-minded, that sort of a thing, that really detract from doing it. It might be in your car yelling at that dumb driver and having, that would also be silly talk, because there's nothing you can do about it. And the Christian that you happen to be yelling at, that's on his way to church too, might be discouraged by that. That's just foolishness is what that is. Or mumbling under your breath, when saying negative things, mumbling under your breath, that you really shouldn't be saying, and then someone hears you. That is foolish talk. But I think it's like what Jim said. It's just, there's just a sober-mindedness that is absent in that.
Well, I think, Steve, what throws me in this in verse 4 is that it's a contrast. It's not this, but that. And when he puts in, but rather giving of thanks, it's like, well, is that all we're supposed to do? I get the picture of, the monks wearing their brown hoods and their hands, folded politely in front of them or tucked inside their sleeves or something. And I don't know that that's what Paul is asking us to do here. Or at least I don't think it's what Paul's asking us to do here, but I kind of get that picture when I read this verse, that everything needs to be serious. And I don't think that's accurate, but Yeah, the last part, the giving of thanks, is what kind of confuses me.
Yeah, well, giving thanks is really honoring God, recognizing good things, and I think really is there's an element of purity in that, right? Where if people joke around, even if you look in read through the New Testament, John 11, the apostles, Jesus is like, I'm going back to Jerusalem for Lazarus, and they said, they were just looking to kill you there. And he's like, yeah, but I need to go. We need to walk while we have the daylight. And then the disciples, Thomas particular, says, all right, let us go die with him. You see kind of a humor to statements like that, where it's kind of sarcastic. Yeah, I guess if he's going to go die in Jerusalem, we'll go die too. And just kind of that thing. But it's not stupid. It's just, but it is lighthearted. And so I don't think it gives the impression of don't have any fun, don't joke around, but don't joke around in a way that's going to discredit God. Yeah, I'm a Christian. If that's what Christians do, I don't want any part of that. That sort of a thing is.
I think that's
be sober. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good explanation of that. It's not that you don't joke around or can't joke around, but don't do so in a way that discredits God. That's a good way to put that, I think.
So, I appreciate you asking and the clarity on that, because some of those things are challenging. Getting back to what James is saying, is a lot of that stuff is going to come from what is the internal motivations that you have in your life. So any more thoughts or questions on that? Let's see where our time is actually. I think we're over time, so I'm just going to stop here. We're not going to finish. I thought we'd for sure get through chapter 3, but we'll go ahead and stop here. We'll pick up the rest of chapter 3, and this actually transitions into 4 pretty nicely. So we'll go ahead and do that. Any thoughts or comments before we close in a prayer?